wanted to because the testimony is only part of how it happened. If you'll remember last Sunday, Pat towards the end said, or his quick summary of his testimony, he said, if you remember, he said he was listening to a Billy Graham revival talk, and he said, immediately, he said, that's for me. I want that. Well, for me, it wasn't quite that straightforward. I'm not one of these guys that you tell me something, I'm not gonna buy it. We gotta do a little research. So, I need to give you just a little background, if you don't mind. When I was a kid growing up, we didn't go to church. Mom thought, we actually went 5 or 6 times to an Easter service. I guess Mom thought, well, if we went once a year, that would take care of everything. So I was exposed, though, even during those 6 times, to a little bit about Christ, but not enough to buy into it. But the good side of that was, those encounters led me to believe that maybe there might be a God out there. How could this many people be wrong? It might be a possibility that God exists. So from there, I get up on into undergraduate school, and I'm still not a believer, but I'm not convinced enough that there isn't a God to claim that I'm an atheist. I can't go that far. So I claimed during those college years that I'm an agnostic. That sounded kind of intellectual to me at the time, so I'm an agnostic. We'll come back to that point a little later. So what happened next is I finished my master's degree, and Brigham Young University offered me a fellowship to come out there and get my doctorate in physics. So Lana and I go out to Provo, Utah. And the second semester out there, I interviewed with the Atomic Energy Commission, if you all remember that. That was the nuclear weapons program. And they offered me more money than I thought anybody should make. So I dropped out of school, went to work for the Atomic Energy Commission, and Lana and I moved to Amarillo, Texas, and I worked at the Pantex plant. The work that I was going to be doing, I did a lot of pure research in new high explosives. But the other thing, I did a lot of prototype work. So I needed 2 technicians. I needed a full-time chemical technician, but I also needed a part-time machinist as a technician. So they assigned a technician to me by the name of Bill Allen. If you all remember last Sunday, I mentioned Bill Allen. Well, Bill Allen was just an old country boy from Altus, Oklahoma. But Bill had 2 things going for him. He was a solid as a rock Pentecostal Christian, and he was a very good machinist. So during the time that Bill worked for me, probably 2 or 3 times every week, Bill would somehow manage to tell me something about Jesus. So I just blew him off, of course. I didn't pay attention to this kind of guy. And this went on for over a year, maybe close to a year and a half. And then a couple of events happened about that same time, after this period of passing. We lost our first baby. And so Lana wanted to start going to church. And at the same time, one morning at work, my X-ray diffraction unit blew up. Something burned out inside my X-ray fluorescence unit. And I'm sitting in there running the neutron accelerator, and a coupon port parted inside the transfer lines, and now I've got radioactive debris everywhere. I'm having a really bad hair day. And about that time, Bill Allen walks in. And Bill said, I've just finished reading this really great book, and if you read it, it'll change your life. And I said, BJ, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to read the book, I'm going to write you a critique as why this guy's a nut, and I don't want you to ever talk to me about Jesus again. And Bill said, okay. Well, the next day he brought the book. And that book, Roy's read too, it's called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. Okay? So I took that book home and started reading it that night. And I was right. He was ready to be sent to the funny farm. But you can't be open-minded and critique something unless you've studied the reference material. Lana had an old Thompson Chain Reference Bible that we used for a dust catcher.
That's not true.
And so,
We use the dust catcher.
so I opened that King James up, I started to read it, it said absolutely nothing to me. Okay? And then I thought, you know, this is probably biased anyway, and may not be very factual. So let's just go back to the original. So I bought a Greek Bible, I bought a Greek interlinear Bible, I got a Greek to English lexicon, I got a Septuagint, and I enrolled in the Greek course at the university. So I'm ready to study.
He's going to touch up the whole world.
Prove to the world that Hal Lindsey's a nut, and the Bible's wrong. Well, that worked out well. Let's let the studies begin. So I start studying, and every night, and as I'm learning the Greek, I start to translate the Gospel of John. So Lana will tell you, I'd come home from work, I'd head to the bedroom, and I'd study till supper time, and she'd feed me back to the bedroom, and I'd study till 10. I'd go out and walk my mile, come back and shower, and then study till midnight again. Now, in the meantime, since Lana's wanted to go to church, we start going to the Church of Christ. And it didn't take me long to realize they had a couple of major glitches in their doctrine. And so we switched over to First Baptist. So now with all the studying, we're going to church on Sunday mornings, Sunday nights, and Wednesday nights with the Baptists. And I'm starting to hang out with the men's prayer group at the Presbyterian church on Monday mornings. I'm hanging out with the Spirit-filled Catholics on Thursday night. So I'm obsessed with this. Isn't that right, Mom? So this goes on now for another 18 to 24 months. This is a ritual. And finally one day, Bill Allen called me. He said, hey, I'm down at the Bible bookstore and they've just got a new translation and you need to come down and see this. So I go down to the bookstore and I pick up the Bible, and obviously I open it up to the Gospel of John, because I'm going to see how good of a job they've done. And so I read about the first 4 chapters out of John, and it's essentially verbatim of what I've spent 18 months doing, translating that one book. So this is going to speed things up. So I bought 3 of them, 2 for me and 1 to give to my mom, and that was the New American Standard. Incredible translation if you don't have one. So that began to speed things up. And for me, speed is probably different than how you
17 years.
So I'm studying and I've read the New American Standard so much, I almost have it memorized. And to show you what a jerk I was still at the time, I used to ask Amanda to just open it up and read the verse so I could tell her where she was reading it. And so I could tell you either the verse, or I might be off plus or minus 1 verse from where she was actually reading. This arrogant guy is still in the learning process. And one day after reading it for the nth time, I flipped over to a little verse that and I'm sure you're all familiar with. Paul makes the comment, he said, I don't know anything other than Christ and him crucified. He said, that's a stumbling block for the Jews and it's foolishness to the Gentiles. And every time I've read that before, I'd always focused on the first part of that. And the first part was, Paul says, I know nothing. And I'm thinking, and I've always thought, this is Paul talking. He's fluent in Hebrew, he's fluent in Greek, he's a PhD in Old Testament, he's studied under Gamaliel, and he's on the next list, the short list, to become a member of the Sanhedrin. And he says, I know nothing.
And he was a murderer.
Yeah. And so it wasn't computed, but this time I looked at the rest of the verse. It said it's stumbling block to the Jews and it's foolishness to the Gentiles. And I looked at that and I thought, you can believe that one person that was innocent could actually take one person's place and die for them. Paul talks about that in the Bible too. Jesus talked about that. But how can one man take the place of all of us? That's foolish. And the Jews, on the other hand, they were looking for a king that was going to come and kick the Romans out and reestablish them as being the power. So a crucified Messiah makes absolutely no sense. And then I thought, that's exactly what God would do. So the following Sunday, I finally made my decision of what I was going to do. So at the altar call, I go down front, still a little arrogant. But the deacon that met me down at the altar, he asked what I thought was a bizarre question at the time. He said, how do you come today? That caught me off guard. And I said, well, I come claiming Romans 10, 9 and 10 for myself, and I want to be baptized. So the following Sunday, I in fact was baptized. And that's how this whole thing began. But it's just the beginning. Roy wanted me to add a couple more things as we went. After I was saved, things physically at the house began falling apart. The starter locked up in the Thunderbird one day, and I drove home with the starter still engaged. And a few days later, the hood blew open on the Buick, and like got a keel, broke the windshield. And then I took the Buick after I got the hood on it and drove it to work one day, and the thermostat stuck and it melted down the engine. Everything was falling apart. But at work, things were getting better. I went from being a scientist to a senior scientist to a project scientist. Then we had a little falling out with them with OSHA over some safety regulations, so I bailed out and went to work for Dow Chemical. And I started out as just a service supervisor, made district engineer, region engineer, bailed out again, went to Dresser Industries as an area engineer, became the tech manager. Now by 84 and 85, Len and I together were making so much money that we had quit going to church. Well, you gotta make a lot of money, you gotta have Sundays to go shopping, right, and spend all that money. So we quit going to church. And then, Roy and I both experienced this thing. I got to thinking at that point, I am good. Am I talented or what? Look at what I've accomplished in this period of time. And then, in June of 86, it was like the Lord said, I'm not big boy, I did this. And got laid off. And so now I'm unemployed for making big bucks. But I've got a lot of time now. So with the time I can start studying again. And we can start going to church again. We have time now. So this went on from June of 86 until January of 87. In January of 87, I'm sitting there on the fireplace hearth one afternoon studying, and I happened to look up, this is the part really like, I happened to look up, and two big angels walked out of the bedroom.
Oh.
they're tall, I had to stoop to get out, through the end of the living room. And the one walks over to me and holds up a check, and that check said, Nalco Chemical Company, $4,000. Remember that? Well, about a week later, one of the Nalco representatives that used to call on me when I was employed, called and talked to Lana. And he asked what I was doing, and I said, well, he's laid off, he's looking for a job. And Mike said, well, I think I can get him a job with Nalco Chemical. So another week goes by, and Nalco calls, and they said, we're gonna pay for you an airplane ticket if you'll come down to Houston and interview with us. So I'm kind of excited, needless to say, after what I've seen. So they fly me down to Houston, and I interviewed with them, a bunch of them, all day long. And finally, at about 4 o'clock, they called me back in, and the general manager said, we would really like to hire you. We'll make you a job offer. He said, but we can't offer you nearly what you've been making, because times are tough. And he said, if you'll take the job, things will get better, and then the money will start coming. So he said, I know you'll need to talk this over with your wife, but if you can do it, we would like to hire you, but we can't pay you but $4,000 a month. Okay? So now I'm all giggly inside, but I'm trying to keep a straight face. And I said, well, my wife and I have already talked about that, and we've decided that if you offered as much as $4,000, we take the job. So we moved to Houston.
John said, I would never leave Houston.
Yeah, we both said we're never gonna go to Houston. I said that twice, because I've had the opportunity twice to go to Houston. So we go to Houston, and I started going to a little church there, a little Assembly of God church, and they had a lot of problems. Well, Lana found us a house there, and this particular house was located just off a cul-de-sac where Phyllis and Anthony Bacon and Bill Alders lived, and it wasn't too far to the Florence's house or to the Harris's place. So we were in this neighborhood, but that was the 4 families that had just left the Assembly of God church. So we became really good friends with them. In the meantime, now they've started a little church up. So we joined up with them. But with just 4 or 5 families, we can't hire a full-time pastor. And so the 4 of us took turns bringing the message to church. And we'd have a lot of visitors come by, and they'd stay for 2, 3, 4 weeks, and then be on their way. Some of them would stay, so we grew a little bit. And finally I asked Dennis, I said, why are everyone leaving? Why is everyone leaving? He said, the big complaint is the fact that we don't have a full-time minister. And this was in '92. And I thought, well, I don't want to be a minister. Why if I would go back to school and get my degree in theology? At least we could say, we do have a theologian on board, a degree theologian. And Anthony was a high school counselor, so we say, well, we've got a counselor too, these guys can help you with issues. And so in September of '94, I finished my master's degree. And then I had this great idea, is where this is leading to. This great idea, I rose up one more time. Because as I finished my degree, and I thought, you know, that was relatively straightforward for me. I had all A's but 1. I thought, I'm gonna get my doctorate. I'm going to get my doctorate. And the Lord said, as plain as day, inside my head, you are not going to get your doctorate because I've given you more wisdom now than you're using. And that kind of wilted me. And so I let a couple of weeks go by. And I thought, I'm gonna do this anyway. I'm doing this because I want to. So I filled out all the application forms and filled out the check, and I sent it all in. And about a week later, I get the envelope back from the university. and I'm expecting to be accepted, right? So I open it up, and there's my check, and there's a letter. And the letter said, "Dear Curtis, we regret to inform you that we've lost our accreditation on our doctoral program." And I often wondered if I caused that, because I wasn't supposed to have done that. Okay? So that was the two additional events that I wanted to add, that I thought were of a little interest. But it was a cool experience, learning the Greek, going through the Greek, and that's some of the stuff I want to share with you today about the Greek. And I told our class that Greek is an incredible language, but when you first read it, it's backwards to us. And so, as I've told the class, the Greeks would say, "Throw the cow over the fence, some hay, we will." So anytime I read something in the Greek, I have to read it all the way through the first time to find out who did what, how many of us did what, and did we already do it, or are we gonna do it? Then you have to go back and put it into the way we would say it. You know, we aren't gonna say throw the cow over the fence and hey, we will. So you gotta turn that all around. But there's some cool things, once you learn that, there's some cool things about the Greek that I just love. They can be very specific with some words. Where we only have one word. One of the words I want to talk about is the word look. Just the simple word look. And that's the only word we have for it. And this story goes back, you have to, God knows. You remember where Mary has just left the tomb? And she comes and tells John and Peter that the Lord's gone. He's missing. So it says John and Peter ran to the tomb. Well, John gets there first because Peter's a little overweight. So John gets there, and our Bible says John stopped at the entrance and looked in. Peter finally catches up, and he's panting, but he runs right on into the tomb. And our book says, and he looked. Okay? And then the next line says, and John went on in, and he looked in. And that's all we know about it. Except when you read it in the Greek, it's a little more meaningful. When John gets there and stops at the entrance and looks, that word is the word bleptai. And that's actually the word that we have as look. He's just looking. And Peter goes on in, and they could have chosen that same word, but they didn't. They chose the word when Peter goes in and look, they chose the word theori. We get our word theory from that. Peter goes in, and he's not just looking, he's putting together a theory why the Lord's missing. And now John goes on in there and looks again, except this time the word is eidein, which means looking with understanding. John is putting together the pieces, what Jesus had been telling him about, that he's going to die and rise again on the third day. Now tell me that's not more meaningful than just looking. So it's very specific. I want to give you one more of the specific words like that, and that's the word love. We have the word love. In the King James, sometimes it uses the word charity, because that's about as close as we can come. But there are several words in Greek, depending on what they're talking about. The first one in the Greek is eros. We get our word erotic from that, and we call it love, but it's actually lust. The next word in Greek for love is phileo. But phileo means brotherly love. That's the bond that Roy and I have. It's just brotherly love. And then there's the agape love that Jesus introduced them to, that means unmerited or undeserving love. So that's another love. Then there's a fourth word, it's called storge, and storge is the specific love that parents have for their kids. So they have all these specific applications for the words, and we just say, well, love. And then the Greek, classical Greek, had one more word for love, and we're all familiar with it. It was called philanthropy. And philanthropy was somewhere in between being phileo and being agape. It wasn't deserved, but they weren't doing it for the totally right reason. So that's the other word for a specific application. Another one that they have that we kind of don't have, but sometimes do, some of the words have dual meaning. And remember the story where Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, and he's talking about the wind. And remember he said, you can't see the wind. He said, the Spirit is like the wind. You can't see the wind, but you can tell by the leaves rustling on the trees, or the blade of grass going by, you can tell that the wind's there. So you know something's taking place. And he said, and the Spirit's just like that. He said, once you've been born again, you can see those things that the Spirit's doing. You can't see the Spirit, but you see the things the Spirit's doing. And the catch is that in Greek, spirit and wind is the same word. It's pneumos. And we get our word pneumatic from pneumos, because pneumos means wind-powered or air-powered. So they have that connection that we typically don't have in English. Another one I just love, so this will lead us back to how I started. I'll give you one word first. The word gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge. Let me back up just a hair. I better do this piece first. Another thing cool about the Greek is you can take a word, and if you just simply put an A in front of that word, it means exactly the opposite. So if you take the Greek word apostolos, it means someone who has been summoned in or called in. So if you put an A in front of that, it becomes apostolos, which means someone who is sent out. Now, apostolos is a word that you all should recognize. Everybody recognize apostolos? Okay. Now we're back to the Greek word gnosis, means knowledge. And a person who is a knowledge seeker, or seeking after knowledge, is called a Gnostic. So guess what an agnostic is? So when I first learned that, I had to laugh at myself, because here I was claiming that as an agnostic, I was intellectual. And what I was really saying is, boy, I'm opposed to knowledge. And so I found a little humor in myself over that one.
Can I add something there?
Sure.
Previous to all of this, there's things going on in the background, of course. And we had a little tiff one day when we first got married. Do you remember that?
Depending on what it was.
I told you, there's something I know that you don't know. You remember that?
Mm-hmm.
I do.
What was the rest of it?
It took you all those years from that to discovering the gnosis, agnosis, and the agape. Took all those years.
Took a lot of years. We'll throw that in as a sidebar here. One of the things that Lana said one time, which I found some humor in, we're walking down this road together, and there's a ladder in the road. Lana essentially walks out around the ladder, and she's standing there waiting, and I'm climbing this ladder of knowledge, and I get to the top of the ladder, and this is your story. I get to the top of the ladder, and unbeknownst to me, I'm coming back down. I'm still gaining knowledge. I'm just on the other side of the ladder. I get all the way to the bottom, and this has taken years to do that. And she's just standing there waiting for me all this time. She's just accepted it just like that Pat did. But that wasn't going to work for me. I'm a data gatherer. I have to have lots of information. One more I want to share. Y'all have heard this probably too, especially when you're talking to some of the atheists that think they're knowledgeable, and they say, well, the word rapture is not in the Bible. Right? You've heard people say, well, the word rapture is not in the Bible. Well, it isn't in our Bible, but it is in the Vulgate, because that's Latin. Okay? The word that's in the Greek Harpaje Somita. Are you ready for the Harpaje Somita? Now you know why we say rapture. I can't even pronounce it unless I stop to think about it. But the catch is, our Bible does have that in it, in English. And there's three times it's mentioned, rapture. Remember when Philip was preaching to the eunuch? And after he talked to him, it said, he's caught away, and he found himself at Azotus. That's rapture. That's the word we call rapture. The second time it's used is when Paul in 2 Corinthians is telling the story, and he's actually telling the story about himself, but he doesn't say that, because he says 14 years, I knew a man who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. He said, I don't know if he's in the body or out of the body, but that happened. Remember when they killed him, they stoned him to death and drug him out in the dump to the dump? And Luke and the boys are all standing around praying for him, and he comes back to life. I think he was actually dead, but he was caught up to the third heaven. So that's the other rapture. And the third one, obviously, is in Thessalonians, where he tells us that at that last moment, we will all be caught up out of here to meet him. Well, the same word for that Harpaggio Samhita is just Harpaggio, and it's more abrupt than we give it credit for. We think about being caught, but it's an abrupt event. It's more like snatched out of here than just caught out of here, because it happens quickly. And to think about Philip over there, he's instantly transfigured over here. And the next time he blinks his eyes, he's already at Azotus. So it's an abrupt event. Does that all make sense? Okay. And then I have a word that I want to show you. This is one of the words you can actually show. And it's the word repentance. And I think a lot of us, when we think about the word repentance, we think about giving up something. Giving up something. But here's the repentance. The Lord has told me to go to Montrose. He wants me to talk to somebody in Montrose. So I'm starting out on my journey to Montrose, and then I get over here, and I decide I'm going to go to Lake City instead. And I get over here, and then I do one of these. And I decide I better come back down here and get back on the trail he's put me on. The word repentance in Greek actually is the word metanoia, which means with complete change of mind. You've changed your mind about what you've decided to do, and you're going to go on to Montrose like you told me to do. Okay? So that's kind of a visual on what a repentance really is. It's a mind change, not just giving up something. And then here's another word that I've been big on after I read it in Greek, and it shocked me. We sing songs about, by the way, the music today was very appropriate for some of this stuff that I was going to be talking about. We sing the song, He Bought My Soul at Calvary. Remember that song? He bought my soul at Calvary. And then when we read it in our Bible, it says He ransomed us. But that's not exactly what took place. It's close, but it's not exact. Here's what really happens, to put this back into a perspective. I've been kidnapped. The kidnapper's holding me hostage. And he gets on the phone and he calls my dad. He said, I've got your son captive over here, but for $1 million, I'll turn him loose.